Well, I heard the alarm, so it must be time for us to get started here. Or maybe that's an alarm because we're starting. I don't know. We'll see. Well, it's good to see everybody this morning, and we're going to be studying from chapter 18, get into chapter 19. We'll see how far we get. And we've got 3 sessions left today and the next 2 weeks, so we'll try to pace this where we can more or less finish with chapter 21. All right, good to see everybody this morning. Let's start with a word of prayer, if we may. Father, we're grateful for this opportunity to be together as your children. We give you thanks for the blessings that we enjoy in your Son, Jesus Christ, and we're thankful for these accounts about his life and all that he accomplished on our behalf. And even today, as we study about his trial and his crucifixion, we are reminded of the price that was paid for our redemption. We pray that you will bless us in our study, be with our other classes, be with those who are following online, and be with those unable to be with us. We pray for them in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So here's our schedule, and we'll start at verse 28 today, and chapter 19 is concerned with the crucifixion, about halfway through there, verse 16, so we'll see how far we get. Then chapter 20 will have to do with the resurrection, and then chapter 21, his appearance after his resurrection. All right, so just to remind ourselves, we're suggesting that this is kind of a 2-part study, the introduction being all the signs Jesus works, and the heart of the gospel being this section starting from chapter 13 through the end, and sometimes described as signs on the one hand, and then the glory, which is the way John describes Jesus' crucifixion. So we looked at these chapters that lead up to the trials and the crucifixion, Jesus spending time with the apostles. We won't go over that again today, but those are supplemental chapters as far as the other Gospels are concerned. John appears to be giving us additional material, and we're, of course, grateful for that. So let's look at chapter 18 at verse 28. And what we've got here, we're describing it as 7 scenes, so it's back and forth here. And we'll kind of look at this. So Pilate is obviously prominent in all of these scenes, and he has interchanges with the Jews on the one hand, with Jesus on the other hand, and then the soldiers come into play at the start of chapter 19. So we'll just kind of trace these one after the other and see what happens as we go through each of these scenes. And before we do that, we'll see here in just a moment, Jesus is led from, well, where did he go first? Do you remember last week? Who's the person to whom he first went that was kind of the de facto high priest? Starts with an A. Annas, okay? So he goes to Annas, is questioned there, and then he's led away to Caiaphas, and we don't really, we'll see in a moment, we don't know much about that. From the other gospel accounts, what we do know is that Jesus was led at some point before the entire Sanhedrin. John seems to just kind of skip over that part because he is going to focus on Pilate. But you'll recall from the other gospel accounts that when he goes before the Sanhedrin, they try to trump up some false charges. They finally revert to false witnesses in order to get Jesus to say that he's the Son of God, which is in their minds blasphemous, although that's not the charge they're going to bring to Pilate. They're going to use another charge in front of Pilate because Pilate has to authorize the death penalty if they're going to carry that out, which they want to do. So I started into all that to say he's led before certain officials, and we're going to read about the praetorium here in a moment. Praetorium, you can hear it there. I don't have it on the slide. It comes from the word praetor, P-R-A-E-T-O-R. That's a Roman official, and they had different officials. They had a procurator, praetor, prefect. But you can see how a praetorium would kind of describe where a praetor would be. And so the question is, where is this that Pilate was? Pilate didn't normally reside in Jerusalem. He was probably here because it was Passover. Do you remember where Pilate's normal headquarters would have been? Not in Jerusalem, but where? Up on the coast. Caesarea, okay. Not Caesarea Philippi, which is up north in Galilee, but Caesarea, which is over on the coast. But he would come up to Jerusalem on occasions such as this, in part to make sure that the Jews didn't misbehave, because the Jews were prone to misbehaving because they didn't like the Roman domination. So here is Pilate in Jerusalem in the praetorium. Some question as to whether this is. So there are a couple of places it might have been. And so you see there here's the temple area up here. Okay. So this building over here was where Herod would have been. And it's possible that Pilate would use this for his headquarters when he came to Jerusalem. Now, remember Jesus, I don't really have this so much on the map, the Mount of Olives would have been over here, across the valley. And they would have arrested Jesus and brought him in to Annas and Caiaphas. And you'll see in a moment, maybe this building here, the Hasmonean Palace, that's where the high priest would have resided. So that maybe is to where he would have been taken and then possibly now led before Pilate over here. The other option is that Pilate was staying in the Antonia, which is a fortress in the corner, the northwest corner of the temple. And if you remember when Paul was arrested in the temple back in Acts 21, the soldiers rushed from the fortress there and got him and took him to the steps, and he started to make his defense to the people until he got to the word Gentiles, and they started to take him and almost kill him. But that's the Antonia. And then this other building I mentioned, the Hasmonean Palace here, which is outlined there. Okay, so not a big deal necessarily, but just to give you some kind of context for where these things are taking place or possibly taking place. So, verse 28, they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. That's the praetorium. It was early morning. So overnight, they've taken Jesus, Annas, Caiaphas, Sanhedrin. They've gotten charges against him. And then look at the end of verse 28. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters. So they took him there, but they didn't enter so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. All right, so this raises a couple of questions here. A, what would be defiling about entering into the headquarters, the praetorium? Okay, Pilate was a Gentile, so I guess they would have considered that to be a defilement to enter into a place like that, especially during the Passover. It says so they could eat the Passover. Now, the second thing is, it was some kind of defilement attached to it. I thought that Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover. The Passover would be on the 14th, the evening of the 14th of the first of the month, where they would take the lamb and kill it and then eat this meal together. So, if they've already eaten it, if that was the night before, why are these officials worried about defiling themselves for the Passover? And some have said as a result of that, well, okay, John's not in sync with the other Gospels. No, that's not the case. The Passover could refer to the Passover, But what followed the Passover? Feast of the Unleavened Bread, all of which would be considered Passover. And it's a little bit like we would say, well, what are you doing for Christmas? Okay, when is Christmas Day? It's the 25th of December. But what do we sometimes mean by Christmas? The holidays. You know, schools get out a couple of weeks for Christmas, or 3 weeks maybe. So the Passover could refer, yes, to the actual meal itself, but there were a lot of things involved in those 8 days surrounding it that would all have to do with whether or not you had been defiled. And so they're being very careful not to defile themselves, not only for that initial meal, but for all that would follow. Okay. And we'll kind of come back to that here in a minute. So, Pilate asks, he goes outside to them. I guess he's honoring their concern about being defiled. He asks, what accusation do you bring against this man? So he's asking for charges. Now, you know, many have theorized, and it's possible that there's some collusion between Pilate and the officials in all of this. Would that be hard to believe? Probably not. That maybe there's been some communication of some sort beforehand about what's going to happen here. We don't know, but it would be a possibility. But at any rate, he asked them, you know, what's the charge against this man? And so they answer, if this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. So how do you understand their reply here? Okay, so Rick says this is the kind of their irritated way of responding. I think he's right. It's kind of like, hey, we wouldn't be bringing him here if we didn't have a charge. Why are you asking about a charge? Okay. Okay. And maybe it's possible they might be feeling like they're kind of on shaky ground here. They don't have a hard set case set in stone. So to interrogate about this, them, not the criminal, is unexpected. But they say we wouldn't have brought him before you if we didn't have a charge against him. Well, okay. Maybe not, but make your charge. Don't just assume that what we're doing is right. And so Pilate responds, verse 31, and says, take him yourselves and judge him by your own law. Maybe Pilate's getting a little bit irritated. I mean, I know this is just at the outset, but maybe he's just saying, look, you deal with this matter amongst yourselves. Which, you know, if there's been some collusion beforehand, you can see why there would be irritation, but we don't know that. And they answer, it is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Okay, so there seems to be a need, in order for them to have Jesus executed, they need to have the Roman approval of that. Yeah, Ian? Okay, yeah, passing the buck. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, okay. So it may be a back and forth because, you know, nobody wants to actually do that. And we're going to see that Pilate gets even more and more reluctant to do that, certainly as the trial, quote, trial proceeds. Okay, so they say, well, it's unlawful for us to put anyone to death. There were limitations on what the Jews could do, and especially in the case of capital punishment. Now, I think there was some, if my understanding is correct, they did have a right if someone were to enter into the temple area itself. That's a case where maybe they could take the person and do something with them. But this is not the charge against Jesus. And so they're needing the approval of the Roman authority in order to do this. And what's really interesting about this? They say it's unlawful in order for us to put him to death. You see any irony here in this whole proceeding? You know, they've been concerned about not being defiled for the Passover. Who have they got under arrest here? The Son of God, the Lamb of God, the Passover. So they're really scrupulous about not being defiled themselves so that they can eat the Passover. No scruples whatsoever about taking this man and falsely charging him and trying to trump up the charges so we can put him to death. Okay? So not so much concern there, is there? And then verse 32 tells us this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. So what does that have to do with? Well, possibly, you look back to chapter 12 where Jesus had said in verse 31, now is the judgment of this world, now will the ruler of this world be cast out. Verse 32, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth. So this idea of being lifted up would fit what mode of death? Crucifixion. You're being lifted up. As opposed to, say, stoning. You're not being lifted up, literally. So that may well be what this is referring to, that Jesus had said, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. So, you know, there's an inkling, I mean, we would know this already, but the very use of the word fulfill suggests what about all of these proceedings? Yeah, prophecy. And with that prophecy comes what? Is this just a series of random events that are taking place and suddenly Jesus is caught up in this and he didn't suspect it? Not at all. This is happening based upon what God had planned and what Jesus, is carrying out. This is a divine mandate. This is not just some human plan that's taking root here. All right, other comments there on that scene before we go to the next one? Yeah, Juan? Okay, so Juan points out that when he talked to Nicodemus, there was also this reference to being lifted up and, them looking upon him like they looked upon the serpent. Okay, good. All right, well, let's go to the second scene. This one is Jesus and Pilate. So Pilate goes back in and he asks Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And that's kind of a loaded question. Why? I mean, could have been a loaded question. Okay. Yeah, so this idea of being a king, why would that play into the hands of the chief priests and the leaders, that he might claim to be a king? George? Okay. Yeah, they're looking for insurrection. So even though it was blasphemy before the Sanhedrin, now it's insurrection before the Roman authority, because that's an affront to Caesar's authority, isn't it? So are you the king of the Jews? Well, it is a loaded question because up to this point, who have been the kings of the Jews? The Herods, most recently, who are actually, they've got Edomite in their blood, and they've been granted this authority, Herod the Great, and then his sons, and then his grandsons eventually. But they're kind of puppet kings as far as Rome is concerned. They're being granted this rule from them. Or, on the other hand, who else have you got that seem to be claimants as far as being a king? What was going on generally at this time probably continues to go on all the way up to 70 AD. What have you got among the Jews as far as a king of the Jews? What did Gamaliel in Acts 5 tell his council members, Sanhedrin members, not to get too excited about punishing the apostles, because it'll be shown whether it's of God or of men? And he gives a couple of examples of what? Men who have done what? Led uprisings, insurrections. So on the other hand, you got these claimants who say, hey, yeah, I'm the Messiah, and they rally some folks around them, and then they get killed, and everybody disperses, or the followers get killed. So it is a loaded question that Pilate is asking Jesus. I don't know that that's why he's asking it. He just wants to know, are you the king of the Jews? To which Jesus responds, do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me? And really, from Jesus' standpoint, let's think about a third meaning of that king of the Jews. What's the true meaning of king of the Jews? Is there a king of the Jews? Yeah, God is the king. And what had God promised to David back in 2 Samuel 7? One of your seed is going to sit and rule on the throne how long? Forever. Okay. So there is a rightful king, a spiritual king, so to speak, but had been a literal king up until the time that they lost their kings due to captivity, and no one has really been on the throne since then. But there is certainly a sense in which Jesus would claim to be the king. Do you think any of these, Pilate or the leaders, really understood any of that? No. So he's asking, okay, who are you speaking for when you ask this? And really, does anyone know what that really means? And Pilate answers, verse 35, am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? Now that's interesting. So you might feel a little bit of sympathy for Pilate. He's kind of on the side here trying to make sense of what might appear to be kind of an infighting amongst the Jews over this man. But he says, well, am I a Jew? But what's sort of the inference in what he says about Jesus? He says, your own nation delivered them to me. Yeah, that's why I'm here, because your people brought him to me. Okay. 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 So he's concerned, among other things, about political power, about political expediency. I mean, this is where, that's probably why he's in Jerusalem to start with. He doesn't want an uprising. He's the representative of Rome. And so the inference here seems to be, well, you must have done something if you're being brought to me, which is, that's not innocent until proven guilty, is it? It's guilty until you can prove yourself innocent. All right? So that's his question, to which Jesus answers, verse 36, my kingdom is not of this world. Have you ever heard that verse before? We all have, multiple times. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting, and I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from this world. So let's unpack that a little bit. What's Jesus saying here? What does he mean? So when he says, my kingdom is not of this world, is he saying my kingdom is otherworldly than just a physical kingdom? How would we describe it? We would say it is a what kind of kingdom? Spiritual kingdom. Okay. So it is, in one sense, it's otherworldly, because it's not like these kingdoms over which Pilate is ruling. It's not just a physical location, territory over which someone is given power. But having said that, yeah, George, go ahead. Okay. 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 So it's really the source of the power, the origin. Where does that come from? And so, in terms of Jesus talking about this, he says, well, my kingdom's not of this world, but does he have authority in this world? Yeah. What statement did he make in Matthew 28, verse 18? All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Does Jesus have authority over all things, all kingdoms, all men, everything? Yes. So, yeah, it's otherworldly, it's a spiritual kingdom, but that doesn't diminish that he has this authority. And so he says, as a result of that, if it were of this world, what would I do? We'd fight this out, and guess who would win? I would, if you want it to come down to that. But my kingdom's not from this world. Now, here is Pilate, and here are the chief priests and the leaders who have brought Jesus. How did they get their positions? How do you get political power? You kind of fight and claw your way to the top, and you take care of the other rivals. And that's true even today, in a sense, not literally fighting, but you got to get up there to the top of the heap. That's not true of Jesus. And so he says, I have all authority, I have rightful authority, but my kingdom's not of this world. Now, Pilate, has asked, are you the king of the Jews? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Okay. And hang on to that idea. I'm not a threat to you, because what Pilate's going to end up saying to the Jews is, he's not a threat to you after all these proceedings that go on. Yeah, he's reluctant, and he's reluctant because he doesn't find any guilt in what Jesus has done. And so he's kind of going over this in his own mind, isn't he? So Pilate says, so are you a king? Verse 37. Let's cut to the chase. Okay, your kingdom's not of this world, but are you a king? That's what I want to know. To which Jesus answers, verse 37, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. So again, Jesus is probably giving Pilate more information than he can assimilate. What's he mean by this? I was born for this purpose. I've come into this world to bear witness to the truth. What's Jesus saying there? Pardon me? Preordained, okay. Yeah, this is all according to the plan. What's been his mission since day one? What's the introduction to John say? The Word became flesh, and he came into this world to proclaim this truth. And what has Jesus been doing every step of the way during his ministry? He is bearing witness to that truth. How has he done that? He's worked signs. He's taught truth. He's bearing witness to the truth. To which Pilate answers this famous quote, verse 38, what is truth? All right. So what do you suppose he means by that? No absolute truth. Right? Yeah. Yeah, and it's almost like a throwaway, like, okay, yeah, well, we could argue all day about what truth is. Has that changed 2,000 years later? A lot of people just say, oh, what is truth? Is there really any objective truth? We live in a postmodern age that says there is no truth. It's just whatever narrative that you construct. Okay. So yeah, he's dealing with people that don't have any scruples. They have scruples about being ceremonially undefiled, but they don't have scruples about taking a man who's innocent and putting him to death. Exactly. And what's really ironic about this is, who is he asking this question of? John 14 and verse 6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. What is truth? He's speaking to the truth, isn't he? So, yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent point. We've made that about other parts, but that's good to make this. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Very good. So he's bearing testimony to Pilate. Okay. And who's really on trial here? Not Jesus. Pilate, among others. Okay. Yes, he does. Yeah. Because when it comes to Jesus, you can't be neutral. And Pilate's trying to be neutral. And Pilate has an opportunity here to hear the truth. And so, in that sense, he really is on trial. And what's John's scope in this gospel? Jesus did these signs so that you might believe, and that believing you might have life in his name. Well, here's an opportunity. Yeah, Michael? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. I thought I had that passage. I've got another one. It doesn't mention the envy. Maybe that's in Matthew. I'll read this other one in Luke in just a moment. Okay, great. Let's go to this third scene. Pilate goes back out to the Jews. After he had said this, verse 38, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. The first time he says that, not the last time. I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So, do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? So apparently the custom is we let somebody go. We let a criminal go. And he says, here's the king of the Jews. It seems like he's saying this over and over again, almost to insult these leaders because they don't hold him to be the king of the Jews. But this is going to stay all the way through that he keeps saying that. You'd almost think it was intentional. Well, what's their answer? Oh no, not this man, but Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a robber. Okay, so let's think about a couple of things here. First of all, this term robber doesn't mean just, I took something, or I held somebody at knife point and I took something from them. It really has more the idea of an insurrectionist, almost what we think of as a terrorist. So Barabbas is probably like those other men that we've mentioned. He's maybe led some kind of an uprising, and he's in prison. And so they say, no, not Jesus. Don't release him. Release Barabbas. The other interesting thing is Barabbas's name, Bar, is son of Abbas, Abba. You remember Galatians 4:4? Jesus talks about cry Abba. What's the word? Father. Son of the Father. Barabbas is son of the Father. Who's the real son of the Father? It's Jesus. But they say, no, we don't want this man released. We want this man. I won't make a political statement, but anyway, we'll release this man guilty, probably guilty of such, for this man innocent of such. Okay? And remember, Jesus had said back in John chapter 10, all who came before me are thieves and robbers. So these that are coming are thieves. The word thief comes from the word kleptes, kleptomaniac. Thieves and robbers, this word. But the sheep did not listen to them. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Okay. Comments? Yeah, Jacob. Yeah. Yeah. Jesus is taken and he's going to suffer for this man who was guilty. Which is kind of symbolic of God's entire plan, isn't it? The innocent for the guilty. All right, look at scene 4. It says Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. And apparently, according to Roman law, there are 3 levels of flogging. This is probably not the worst one here. This is something done, and it seems like Pilate is doing this to sort of diminish Jesus in some way. Maybe this is the passage I was thinking of in Luke 23, which doesn't mention the envy, but Luke 23:13, Pilate then called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither did Herod. That's another thing John doesn't mention, the sending him off to Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him. So maybe that helps explain this flogging. And of course, the soldiers take advantage of this situation. They twist together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and arrayed him in a purple robe. They're mocking, they're making fun of, they're ridiculing. And again, ironically, where had possibly some of those soldiers been just a few hours before? Back in the garden. Back in the garden ready to arrest Jesus, he said, I am he, and what did they do? They all fell down. But now they have Jesus under arrest, and they can take advantage of it. So verse 3, they came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. So they're not having much mercy as far as Jesus is concerned. All right, scene 5. Pilate goes out again. So it seems like now, here he's going to bring out Jesus as if to say, this is the man you're so concerned about. This is the man you want to put to death. He says, see, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. A second time he says that. He hasn't done anything. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, behold the man. Okay? So here's the man that we're all concerned about. And verse 6, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, crucify him, crucify him. So you can just imagine there's a cry that's been taken up. And Pilate says, take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. A third time that he has said that. And so listen to what the Jews say. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Well, that's really the charge they're particularly concerned about. And it seems like, they let that spill out here in addition to what they've said. They're wanting him to be guilty, to be judged guilty. And verse 8, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. Why do you suppose that is? He was even more afraid, having heard that statement. Yeah, okay. Yeah, in the Roman Empire, there were beliefs that had to do, superstitious beliefs that had to do with men being gods. The Caesars at times would claim to be that, okay? And so he seems to be shaken by that. So this language they use about him seems to disturb him. And I think, isn't it Matthew's account that says he hears his wife had a dream about him, and he was concerned about that. So, scene 6, verse 9, he entered the headquarters again and said to Jesus, where are you from? Where are you from? That's really the question about this entire gospel, isn't it? Where are you from? Who are you? Where did you come from? If you think back to John chapter 9, where they were grilling the blind man who Jesus had healed, and they brought him back a second time and said, how are you able to see? And he gives them the answer. And then he says, do you want to be his disciples? And they answer, verse 28, you are his disciples, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. So they on the one hand, they admit their ignorance. We don't know where he is from, but they fail to see that he has in fact come from God, hasn't he? So verse 10, Pilate says to them, you will not speak to me? Do you know that I have authority to release you and the authority to crucify you? So how dare you answer this way to me? I've got authority over you. And Jesus says what? Verse 11, the only reason you have any authority is because God has given it to you. It has been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Maybe he's thinking there about the chief priests. He had said back in verse 35 of chapter 18, your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done? So they're guilty. And so verse 12, from then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. So they seem to know, what's the What's the squeeze point here? You're not Caesar's friend. Why would that make any difference? Yeah, Pilate was ruling at the behest of Caesar. That's the only reason he was able to rule, besides the fact that, God allowed it. And so he says, everyone who makes himself a king, they say, everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. You're not Caesar's friend. And that seems to get to Pilate as well. Verse 13, scene 7, so when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And then verse 14, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Okay, again, preparation, it could refer to preparing for the Passover feast, but as the narrative continues, it was the day before the Sabbath. It was a day of preparation for the Sabbath. It was about the 6th hour, he said to the Jews, behold your king. So that's the second time he has said that. Or no, he said, behold the man. Now he says, behold your king. And they cry out, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And listen to their answer. The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. What's wrong with that answer? It's the right answer politically. Yeah, it should have been God. And what would they have said at any other time to a question like that? They would have said, no, we don't serve Caesar, we serve God. But again, here it's politically expedient to say, oh, well, Caesar's the king. He's the one to whom we give allegiance. And so Pilate, verse 16, delivers him over to be crucified. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, okay. So the struggle throughout this section has been between truth on the one hand and power on the other hand. And Jesus isn't going to fight with physical power. He's going to speak the truth. He's bearing witness to the truth. And that's what he's about. And that's what is going to get him crucified. Okay. Any other thoughts there before we close? Yeah, Michael. Yes. Yeah. 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 Exactly. And that's the point. Aren't we all having to deal with Jesus and who he is? And you can't be neutral. You can't say, oh, well, he was just a man that did this or that. No. He's either the Son of God or he's an imposter. And Pilate had to deal with it. And everyone has to deal with that ultimately, whether they recognize it or not. That's who he claims to be. All right. Yeah, George, go ahead. No. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. If you want to scrutinize the testimony that's been given, Jesus is the one who answers honestly and truthfully. All right, next time we'll start there and go through the rest of chapter 19, probably get into chapter 20 if you want to prepare for that.